What is your last name, spell it, first name, and middle initial?
Kelsey, K-E-L-S-E-Y. First name is Vern, V-E-R-N. Middle initials, L as in Lee.
What year were you born?
November 30th, 1948.
Where did you live when you became a part of the military?
I actually lived in Marion, Kansas, and the reserve unit actually was out of Hutchinson, Kansas.
What branch of service were you a part of?
It was the Navy. It was a Mobile Construction Battalion, MCB 11.
How did you get into service? Was it volunteer or drafted?
Now, actually, I saw that it went by a lottery system, and you really didn't, during that period of time, there were so many people. I mean, just suddenly they'd be there, and the next time they'd be drafted. And so I figured I wanted to go in the way I wanted to go in, because I figured I'd probably be drafted. And if you got drafted, you definitely went to Vietnam. I mean, that's just the way it was. Well, I volunteered and went to Vietnam.
When did you first start service?
It was, I can't give you the exact month. It was probably about 68, 69, that period.
When you chose to volunteer, why did you choose to do it?
Well, just as I said before, I figured I was going to be drafted anyway, and I wanted to go the way I wanted to go. What happened then, and I'll just expand on that a little bit, I was in a reserve unit out of Hutchinson, Kansas, and you'd have reserve training, and then they sent you down to down south to around New Orleans in that area, and we had training down there for about a month. And then we heard that we were going to be activated, the group in that. It really wasn't like a battalion or something. It was just a smaller type group. What they did, they sent us to Treasure Island, which was an island between several of us anyway, to Treasure Island, which is a disbursement center. And they tell you what unit you get your orders there, in other words, tell you what unit you're going to join and what you'd be doing. And Treasure Island is located between Oakland and San Francisco. It's not called that, I don't think, anymore. But there's basically Alcatraz, and then there's Treasure Island. And I don't even know if it's a military base anymore. I was there about a month, and then received orders to go to Port Hueneme, and that's about 60 miles north of Los Angeles. And Port Hueneme consists of mobile construction, several battalions. Battalions are like groups of men that are divided. A big battalion will be divided into like Alpha Company, Bravo Company, Charlie Company, Delta Company, Echo Company. And the whole battalion's about 1,200 men, okay? And it's a mobile construction battalion. What they do, you'd go in and we had our own security detail, and you take turns on guard duty around the camp. And that's when we were activated. But that's basically what it was.
Where was basic?
Basic training, I went to, it was, drawing a blank. It was, they have one in San Diego. I didn't go to that, I went to the other one up by Chicago. And it was an accelerated training. It wasn't, they had a lot longer training. But I was there for basically a couple months, something like that.
Where were you sent after basic for advanced training?
Like I said, that's when we went to Treasure Island and then to Port Hueneme, California. And there in Port Hueneme, they had different classes that went on. For instance, during that period, you'd have to study back when, but there was a lot of things going on. There was a lot of racial unrest. That's when all the fires were in Los Angeles, a lot of demonstrations and riots. And they even went into handling riot control. They went into nuclear and biological weapons. If you ever encountered that or were in that, decontamination. No, I wasn't in that much, but I was in special services, especially, and that we showed, in that case, we showed movies on riot control and things like that, training movies. And then we went down to what they call Broom Ranch, and that was actual military training where they'd have you go up against another group, and of course you were using blank ammunition, and but at the same token, I mean, it was real dry, and this was at Camp Pendleton too. We went there. What they do, they take you up in what they called cattle cars, and I'm telling you, it's literally cattle cars. They're semis that were that were gutted, and they had seats on the inside, and you'd ride wherever you were going in those. It sounds crude, but it was effective. And then they'd make you, police, every time you shot these things, you have your shells, and then you'd have to pick those up and literally bury them, okay? And back then they have long rifles, they were just, had blanks in them, but M1s and M4s. And actually, those are the same. They shoot the same bullet. You hear all about this AR-15s now. They actually shot a .223 shell, and they were semi-automatic just like this, but they don't look wicked. They're just regular rifles. So when people talk about AR-15s, I know that's on another subject, but there's other rifles that shoot the same thing at the same rate of fire, and they carry magazines that are just as full. Camp Pendleton, we weren't there that long, but again, they just kind of have you do basic training along that line.
What was your job when you began military service?
I went in and I was basically in to get out. I mean, the Vietnam War was a violent war. I mean, no wars are calm. They're all violent, and there was a lot of protests. You got to understand, if you study back in your history, I know there's protests now, but it's another area. It's about 50 years ago. It really was. And there was a lot of people violently protesting the war. And then you also had all the racial unrest with all the fires. And there was tremendous lot of fires in Los Angeles when they had that. But let's see here. What was the question again?
What was your job?
Okay, well, the job was, I was in special services, and when I was over there, they had a regular shack for that, and you'd do things like, you'd disperse athletic equipment, and I was in a headquarters company, and we did typing, we did administration, we still stood guard duty like everybody else because we were trained in that. As far as going into some major battle, I can't say I ever was in a major battle, but it was different. It was all, if you want me to tell you a little bit about the camp, it was Camp Evans. It's about, you know what a DMZ is, Demilitarization Zone. You have North Vietnam, then you have South Vietnam. From what I understand, the U.S. went in to make sure that South Vietnam didn't turn communist, okay? Anyway, that was the whole thing. I don't have an opinion. I had an opinion when I was in there, but when you look back on it, and when you look at history, I don't know if that opinion was right or not. I was 30 miles from the DMZ, and that sounds like, golly, that'd be a violent area. There was a lot of violence, but it was in different parts, and when I was there, mainly I'd go shotgun. There was a city called Quan Tri, and we took supplies, things like that, to Quan Tri. The Seabees actually, that was the only city, and the Seabees set it up that had electric lights, and that sounds like a big deal. Big deal is electric lighting. You got to understand Vietnam. It's made up of farmers, and it was out in rice paddies, and everything was crude. It really was. I don't know if you ever heard about some of the things that the soldiers went in. The Cobra and the UE helicopters were used highly in there because they were mobile and you could get around areas like that. But the Vietnamese would use tunnels and things like that to move around underground and surprise troops and kill people. And they used things like around rice paddies. They'd use stakes, and guys would be rocking along or tramping through the rice paddings. These stakes were actually pointed up. They'd have poison on them, and they'd step into them. Not all of them had poison, but can you imagine a stake going through your foot? Anything crude to harm or kill people. And I can't say, you see a lot of other things too, like we had a lot of heavy equipment over there. There was things like they dropped bombs, and they'd napalm is what they called it, and it would spread over a large area. If you can imagine gas, and this was not a gas, but well, I guess it was kind of a form of it. They'd drop it in a bomb, and it'd go for hundreds and hundreds of yards and just be solid mass of flame. And that didn't always do it, because of course that wouldn't get in your tunnels and things like that. My Camp Evans, and that's what it was called Campaigns also before that, but I guess they named them after commanders, and it would send out details out of that camp. And this was on Route 1. And Route 1 was the only thing that was, again, the Seabees did that. They, along the coast, South China Sea, they ran asphalt, just like highways. And you're saying, well, didn't they have it? No, it was rice paddies, it was dirt paths, except for Route 1, which was an all asphalt road that run kind of parallel to the Red China Sea. And they would send out patrols, you'd have to get around with equipment. And there was tanks over there too, and there were South Vietnamese. Of course, it was a totally different time. Again, that was a volunteer type time, where today today is a volunteer. Then it was, they had a lottery system. So you can't say that everybody had their heart into what was going on. But they would send out detachments to rebuild bridges, because they'd be destroyed at night. They'd build a bridge, and at night the North Vietnamese would blow them up. And they had a trail that came down from north. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it would come down and snake into South Vietnam, and that's the way they'd bring down supplies for the North. And it was just, different areas were very violent. Luckily, the time I was there, and I was not there that long, I caught detachments out of there to Okinawa, and also to Guam. And then I was transferred from there to Kodiak, Alaska. And then I ended my military service, and they checked me out through California, in that area. It was Seattle, actually Seattle, Washington was the checkout point. And I was there for about 2 weeks, where they processed you out. That was the reason I was processed out, along with a lot of other people. The war went through a different period. They gear up to thousands upon thousands upon thousands, and this was starting to, they were trying to find a way out of the war. And you need to read the whole history on it, you really do, because it was different than World War I or World War II, or the Korean War. And they were, moving people out of Vietnam. And they sent us out on detachments. What we did in Okinawa was we rebuilt military bases there, Quonset huts and things like that. Go ahead. You probably have other questions here, but that's kind of an overview on and on.
Where did you begin military service after advanced training?
Where did I begin the military? Okay, well, I went from Hutchinson, Kansas to Treasure Island to Port Hueneme. And that's, as far as combat and things like that, the advanced training probably would have been at Port Hueneme and Camp Pendleton and Camp Broome. And then we were flowing out of Point Magoo, which right now, it's been a test site for exotic aircraft. It really is, but it was also a place where they would ship soldiers out of California for Vietnam. We didn't fly your normal, well, back then TWA and American Airlines. These were military aircraft, but they were just names that were changed. This was airlift is what this was called. When I went over there, I flew out of Point Magoo to Anchorage, Alaska, and from Anchorage, Alaska, we flew into Da Nang Air Force Base. When we flew into Da Nang, it was real different. I mean, and there was times that Da Nang was under attack. I think Hamburger Hill, which I don't know if you ever read history, was close to that. But you don't know what to expect when you come to that. You have your M16, which looks like an AR-15, you know, that everybody knows what they look like. We had those up in the storage racks, but you flew in, and again, you didn't know what to expect. They turned out the lights on the plane, I mean, totally, and they flew into Da Nang. And then we got out and we stayed overnight. We slept on concrete with kind of up against our sea bags, and we still had sea bags on that, even though we were dressed in green and all that stuff. It was different over there too. You think when you see military now, you see them all in dress blues or combat fatigues and things like that. In the war, actually, over there, honestly, the guys would wear T-shirts and slacks a lot of the times. You know, the combat, because you're doing different work in it. You sweat a lot. They'd actually give you salt pills to help with sweating so you didn't get sick.
What was happening in the world when you were in the military? Like war, like Cold Wars, or like 9/11, like things like that?
Like I said, it was race wars, violent race riots, and that was all across the country. That and the Vietnam War, that's during when Johnson was in, and finally he just stepped down from presidency. Nixon was the one that was in office when I went over to Vietnam. Yeah, the war, Vietnam War, was very prevalent, and race discontent was very rampant.
How long did you serve in the military?
Actually, it would have been 6 years through the reserves, and what you do, you normally would go back and go to training exercises. What they do is they do training on show films and do different, you know, if you were in the on a ship or something like that, they would show you different films like that, you know, for being on a ship. I was in there about 4 years, and I had the choice when I got out of off active duty. They said, do you want to come to meetings, or since you're in active duty, you just want to call it quits? And I said, I just want to call it quits. And so that was basically it. They have books, training books that you go through too, and they teach you in the reserves, you know. Back then, the reserves ordinarily were not activated. The Guard ordinarily was not activated, but that was such a, they call it a conflict, but it was a war. That the reserves, the Guard, that was all activated. The name just basically was reserves.
What was the reason for you to get out?
Because I wanted to get out. I mean, there's some guys who went through literal hell. I mean, you've got guys who would crawl into tunnels to go after Vietnamese. I mean, these guys have to be half nuts to do something like that anyway, because I think the chances of coming out of something like that would be awful. There's guys that, and this was up by the DMZ too, which I never counted. I mean, there was bases that would come under attack. They had what they called Cobra helicopters, and these were helicopters that were not as advanced as the Apache helicopter, but at night, when your grandpa would set on guard duty or so, you'd see a base way in the future, it was just, or way out, you know, in the distance, and they would just be shooting down these rockets, and it was just like, it sounds crude, but like a fireworks display, because they were, and just like you'd have in your M16s, these, so they could tell where they were shooting. They had long bullets too, just like long ones that they'd be shooting out of the Cobra helicopters, and every 2 to 3, I don't know what it is, it was every other one on the M16, but they'd have what they call tracer rounds, and this way they could see. They would light up a little bit, you know, as they shot them, and they could see where they were shooting at, you know, even though it was dark out. Our guard duty, and we had that too, was around the, it was the perimeter of Camp Evans. What they'd have these towers that would go up, and they'd have different wires that you could set off, like Claymore, where they had what they call Claymore mines. They were like a half U, and they had powder behind it, and then they had the front of it, it was all loaded with things like BBs. When you activated this, it would activate that, and it, you know, if you would suddenly be rushed or something by North Vietnamese, it would send out a wall of shrapnel, you know. They also had these barrels that were loaded with, they call it foo gas, I guess. I don't know if it would be like the type of gases I told you about when, you know, when they would just be a solid flame. If you would be attacked like that, you had several wires, you could activate these different things. You could activate this and it would explode at the same time with other towers around a solid wall of flame out there. The most I experienced on something like that, there was they had wild boars and they had wild, they had water buffalo over there. Water buffalo are like oversized buffalo. I mean, they just, look in your history books, you can see a water buffalo. But they had a wild pig, and they had flares that would set it off. Well, this pig went through these flares and set it off, and of course the excitement that sets off, because you know, you don't know if it's real or not. And another thing that you don't experience now, back when, have you ever heard of green eyes? Or what they are now, you can buy these scopes that you can look at night. I mean, this is taken for granted now. But this was kind of new back then, and we'd use these on our perimeter too, and you could look out and it captures, just like moonlight, it would concentrate that light so you could actually see people out there, and you would see figures of them. And if you took away from that, it'd just be dark, like, you know, a pitch dark night. The crazy thing about it, if someone would be stupid enough to be smoking, or if you'd run it across a light that was in camp, it'd leave like a flashlight glare across it, and then it would disappear. I don't know if the new ones do that or not, but there was different things like that. Each of those towers then were, you had like a 50 caliber machine gun, and that was up on the top of the towers. And they were, you know, you'd have a circle of Camp Evans, and they'd have these towers every so often, every so many hundred feet around there. So they could repel attacks. They really could by doing that. But during the day they sent out things like that. And some of these people that went out on building bridges and stuff like that, they'd have to set up their own perimeters, their own little bases out in nowhere. And that's where it really became dangerous, because they had equipment to fire back with, but not near to the extent that we had around Camp Evans. I mean, you could repel a lot with what we had. Had different things that went on in the CBs prior to me getting there. They set off an ammunition dump. Not we, but they did hit it. And from what I understand, I wasn't in Vietnam yet. That was a gigantic explosion. If you can imagine storing all tons of ammunition in one area and having that go off, it's more than a fireworks display, believe me. And several people were killed in that.
What do you remember most about your time in service?
I grew up on a farm, you know, in Marion, Kansas, and never really got to travel much. Never traveled much. Never went out to eat hardly any, things like that. But in the service, probably I got to see more things, and thankfully I didn't have to see violent things. But I got to travel to more things, places, and see more things, and see how the world, other side of the world lives. What was kind of unusual when we flew into Da Nang, you know, when we first came from and flew over from Anchorage, Alaska, and landed in Da Nang, they had food over there. It sounds silly, but at the time they said, oh my gosh, military food is so bad. I'll tell you, some of the best cooks came out of the military. They really did. I mean, they could really cook things like steaks, and it sounds silly, you had steaks over there? Yeah, we did, really did. And at different times within that camp, they would had barbecue grills, and we'd have hamburgers and hot dogs, you know, just for something different. Within each area, they had huts, and you know, I don't know if you ever saw the pictures of them at home, but they'd be like plywood huts, and then they had roofs on them, and they'd be like screens around it because it was pretty hot, and they had what they called a monsoon season. I've never seen any rain around here like the monsoon season over there. When it rained over there during the monsoon season, it was like somebody holding a bucket of water and pouring it. It was literally that heavy. That didn't happen all the time, but we don't get any, even in violent thunderstorms, we never get rain. Like, it was vast quantities of water coming down, it really was. Different, just different area, different life. These people over there are very poor farmers, rice farmers. They use things like feces to fertilize the rice paddies, okay? Real rough like that. I had a friend, Bob Bass, he was killed over there. And then I had a friend that, he was older than me, but Dean Klenda, he flew these camouflaged planes over there, and he was shot down, and his sister, Deanna Klenda, never did find him. They never could find him. He was missing in action. You know, it's been after 50 years, just like last year or so, you know, feelings are not the same with the farmers and the people over there anymore. They do communicate now. And his body was in a rice field, and it was probably used as fertilizer, literally, for rice, because they never could find him. He had ejected out of the plane, and it crashed, but they never could find him. And finally, his probably identified him by teeth or something, because his body would be decomposed, you know, everything else. They found him, and they were able to add a little closure to it, I guess. I don't know. I've never experienced something to that degree.
What qualities did you believe you carried from the military to where you are today?
Discipline. I think the military, and that sounds, oh golly, you know, yeah, you have to obey orders. The military, even to this day, is totally different from what civilian life is. In civilian life, it's you know, you follow the laws, there's democracy, you vote on this, if you don't want to do this, you don't do this. Military life teaches you these are the people in charge, this is who you listen to, and if you don't, you're going to pay for it in one way or another. You don't experience that to near that degree in civilian life, you really don't. I think the military life is good for a lot of people. Anymore, the service is voluntary, you know, so, and it wasn't like that. So the people in there that are in there today are people that want to be there. They really are. And I can't say that for everybody. I really didn't want to go when I was there, I'm just telling you the truth. But it was a good experience that I got to travel a lot. I got to see how the other side of the world lives, realizing that, man, there are poor people out there. And there's a missionary field in a lot of areas, there really is.
What are your most enduring memories of your time in service?
Enduring? I made friends there. There's some good people. There's a lot of different people in this world, but there's some neat people. And between that and traveling, I think those are probably the most endearing. And learning how some other people live and how other cultures live and how other parts of the country were even, because I hadn't even been around the country that much. And Gulfport, Mississippi, I couldn't think of, had this mental lapse again, down south. When I said down south for training, we went down to Gulfport, Mississippi. It's close to Biloxi, Mississippi. There's an Air Force base down there, but there's also a brand new CB base. It used to all be Quonset huts down there, now it's all brick, red brick. Because Grandma and I used to go down there, and I stopped in there one time, and I couldn't believe it was just totally different base. All we had was leftover World War II Quonset huts, you know, and some wooden barracks that if they caught fire in this day, oh my gosh, it would have been awful. But everything's brick now, so you don't have near that problem. Those are the things I got out of it, I really do. The military's not for everybody. The military is for some people, it really is. And it can be rewarding how much you want to put into it. Obviously, I didn't put that much into it. I went in to get out, I really did. But I'm thankful that I got to go into it in the fact that I seen things that I'd never see otherwise. And then they weren't violent. I didn't see violence like some people. And some people went through some real hell. And some people come back with real mental problems. To this day, they're blocking the streets out there. Maybe not so much in Jeff City, although they are, but in your big cities. And that's the thing about people with mental problems anymore this day, I think, is too many are on the streets. And I'm not saying they should be in mental institutions, but they at least should be getting help of some sort. Anymore, they're left to roam. That's my feeling anyway.
Thank you.
You bet.